King Henry IV treated his wife Marie like a toy, refusing to give her a coronation for a decade and keeping a series of mistresses. But the day after she was finally crowned queen, a horrific karma came for the king. He may have been called Henry the Great, but that doesn't mean he was good. This bloodthirsty hedonist had the messiest personal life Europe had ever seen. Born Henry of Navarre, this French royal came from powerful stock. His mother was the formidable Queen Jeanne d'Albret. His father, Antoine of Bourbon, constantly flaunted his many mistresses in front of his wife. As Henry grew up, his parents' issues got worse, particularly after Jean converted to Protestantism while his father stayed Catholic. In 1572, his mother decided it was high time her 19-year-old son looked for a bride. In response, the infamous Catherine de Médicis, the Queen Mother of France, put forth her daughter Margaret of Valois as an option. Margaret was around Henry's age, a renowned beauty, and from an equally influential family, seeing as her brothers were kings of France. But there was a huge obstacle. Henry was a Protestant like his mother, but Margaret was a staunch Catholic and swore she would never convert. Even the Pope himself weighed in, warning he would never sanction the marriage. As Henry and his family went on with planning the wedding anyway, a tragedy struck. While picking up her wedding outfit in Paris, Henry's mother suddenly took ill and died at the age of just 44. In the blink of an eye, Henry wasn't just a groom-to-be, he was the King of Navarre. On August 18, 1572, just months after his mother's death, Henry and Margaret of Valois married at Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, very much without the blessing of the Pope or many of the French people. In fact, because of his Protestant faith, Henry had to awkwardly stand outside the Catholic cathedral while his own wedding mass took place. The celebrations lasted for days afterwards, but on the 5th day after his wedding, Henry was plunged into bloodshed. Taking advantage of how many prominent Protestants were in Paris for the marriage, a Catholic mob began killing French Protestants en masse in what became the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. For days, high-ranking Catholics hunted down noble Protestants in their own palace rooms, hanging on their doors and killing whomever they could. And one day, they came for Henry. Henry and his new wife Margaret cowered in the Louvre Palace as chaos went on around them, but they couldn't hide forever. Soon enough, Catholic conspirators heaved Henry from his quarters, pulled him into a dark room, and gave him a violent ultimatum. Convert to Catholicism right then and there, or die. Henry was no fool. He chose the option that kept him alive. In the centuries since the massacre, historians have suggested that it was Henry's new mother-in-law, Catherine de Médicis, who masterminded the entire conflict. With the massacre finally ebbing, Catherine de Médicis made yet another power play. She demanded that her daughter annul her marriage to Henry, which is when Margaret confessed that she and Henry had already consummated the marriage. For the next couple of years, Margaret remained loyal to Henry and actively sided with him against her mother and the throne of France, both of which had grown increasingly hostile. Unfortunately for her, Henry repaid that loyalty with betrayal. Henry began to get a reputation that still follows him today, that of an insatiable Lothario. Like his father, he womanized to the point of excess and would soon keep his own roster of royal mistresses. After learning about her hated son-in-law's rapacious libido, Catherine de Médicis knew just what to do. The Queen Mother had a stable of beautiful spies called the Flying Squadron, who she employed to seduce men she wanted to control. She chose the stunning Charlotte de Sauve to do just that with Henry. Once Henry was putty in the spy's hands, Catherine de Médicis upped the ante. She had Charlotte also fall in love with one of Henry's best friends, François d'Alençon. It was a brilliant move. The romantic rivalry tore the friends apart, and Henry spent the following years distracted by his bedroom drama instead of plotting any kind of counterattack. In 1576, when he finally fell out of all-consuming obsession with Charlotte de Sauve, Henry had a cold, hard look at himself. He was all but a prisoner in the French court, attacked from every side by the royal family and no true king of Navarre. Infuriated, he escaped France's clutches while on a hunting trip. Free of his shackles, he denounced his earlier conversion to Catholicism and proclaimed himself a true Protestant. Henry had to abandon his wife in France to escape, and she essentially remained a prisoner to her own family for years. When Margaret finally did manage to reunite with Henry, he dealt her a crushing insult. Upon being reunited with Margaret and her retinue, Henry's wandering eye landed on one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting, the stunning Françoise de Montmorency Fosso. There was just one creepy detail. The poor girl was just 14, but that didn't stop Henry. In one of the most disturbing wooings in the history of royal romances, which is saying something, Henry plied the barely teenage girl with gifts of cakes and sweets. You know where this is going. In a matter of months, Françoise was pregnant. Tragically, the girl's child was stillborn, but the damage had been done. Because after nearly a decade of marriage, the pregnancy underlined the fact that Henry and Margaret were still childless and thus heirless. Never a good position for a royal couple to be in. In 1584, when Henry was entering his 30s, fate threw him a curveball. After a death in the royal family, Henry found himself next in line for the French throne. A plot twist brought to you by supremely incestuous royal family bloodlines. Not what the matriarch Catherine de' Medici would have wanted, but Henry must have been delighted at first. Now that he was the heir apparent to the current King Henry III, it was even more important that Margaret birthed an heir. But instead of focusing on baby-making with his wife, Henry embarked on yet another affair, this time with Diane d'Andois. And while his previous mistress had been a naive teen, Diane was a widow with huge ambition. Soon she was whispering in his ear that it was time to drop the childless Margaret and make her queen. After years of watching Henry gallivant around with other women, not to mention abandon her, Margaret of Valois snapped. Fracked with fears about her barren state, she first tried to poison Henry, and when that didn't work, she tried to shoot him with a pistol, but missed. Her deranged plans foiled. Margaret fled the kingdom before ending up in jail all the same. Ever since Henry became heir apparent to the French throne as a Protestant, all the Catholics in Europe were baying for his demise, and in 1587 they took action. They united as the Catholic League, with Henry as public enemy number one. In no time the League plunged France into a civil war, with Henry fighting tooth and nail on the battlefield to keep his claim to the French throne. Even after the current King Henry III died in 1589, Henry IV's nominal claim was nowhere near secure. Henry liked nothing more after a long day of fighting Catholics than to unwind with some debauchery. Enter his new favorite mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées. The pair met in the midst of his wartime activities, and Gabrielle proved an eerily loyal lover. Even when she was heavily pregnant with Henry's child, she continued living with the king in his little battle tent. But Gabrielle wasn't just a pretty face or a fertile womb. She also pushed Henry into the most important decision of his life. By 1593, Henry had pushed the Catholic League back to the margins, but he still hadn't managed to take the all-important capital of Paris. Then his mistress had a brilliant idea. Gabrielle, who was Catholic herself, convinced Henry to reconvert to Catholicism, since it now seemed to be the only way to get his crown. Once more showing a weakness for women, Henry finally relented and officially became king in February 1594. On top of officially being King of France, Gabrielle eventually gave him a son, albeit an illegitimate one, and would go on to have 2 more children with him. Henry began plotting a way to annul his marriage to his wife Margaret and legitimize his relationship with Gabrielle. By 1599, Henry was charging ahead with his plan to marry Gabrielle, but he was ignoring a crucial issue. For one, the common people hated her, calling her the Duchess of Filth. More importantly, naming his love child as his heir, legitimate or not, was a surefire way to start yet another war of succession. No one wanted him to go through with it, but Henry didn't listen and proposed to a pregnant Gabrielle. Brimming with happiness at her prospects, Gabrielle reportedly preamed that only God or the king's death could put an end to my good luck. Well, God did indeed have ideas about that. In a stunning turn of events, a vicious attack of pre-eclampsia hit Gabrielle just days after she made this announcement, and by the next day, both she and her newborn son were dead. Stunned at his love's loss, Henry believed that Gabrielle's death was God cruelly telling him that he'd been wrong to want to marry his mistress all along. All the same, he mourned her with the most extravagant funeral he could muster, but he took solace in darker comforts too. For long, Henry was back rampaging through houses of ill repute to drown his sorrows. During this time, King Henry was about as hot a mess as you could find on the continent. So when he met the beautiful Henriette d'Entraigues, he was little more than a plaything for the ambitious woman's desires. The child of a famous royal mistress, Henriette knew exactly what she was doing. She used Henry's lingering grief over Gabrielle to get him to write out a promise of marriage to her. Smart girl, stupid Henry. In late 1599, Henry's annulment for Margaret of Valois finally went through, and France really began pushing their 46-year-old king to marry someone and get a true blue legitimate heir before it was too late. Instead of running to Henriette with the good news, he began courting the Florentine noble Marie de Medici. Henry's motives for marrying Marie were not pure. Orphaned at a young age, Marie was an heiress in possession of massive wealth, and Henry had frank signs in his eyes. Henry really soured the whole deal when he wrote a few letters to Marie proclaiming his love, while sending almost the exact same letters to Henriette, who he was still keeping as his side piece. Spurred on by his need for an heir and his legendary libido, Henry married Marie de Medici, and after decades of childlessness with Margaret, Henry's new wife was pregnant before he even got her installed in her Paris apartments at the Louvre. In September 1601, Marie gave birth to a son, the future Louis XIII. The entire time that Marie de Medici was pregnant, she had to contend with an ugly truth. Henriette d'Entraigues was also carrying the king's love child, and gave birth to a son, Gaston, just weeks later. Marie should have been able to rest on her laurels as a true queen the moment she provided Henry with an heir. That is, until Henry told her the cruel truth. He made it clear that she was nothing more than a means to an end, and he even kept delaying her official coronation. After the next decade, Marie had a total of 6 children with Henry, but then again, Henriette bore him more too, and she always seemed to be pregnant at the same time as Marie. Cruelest of all, Henri informed Marie that all the children, legitimate and illegitimate, would live under the same roof. Henri's mistress, Henriette, had been understandably bitter about Marie ever since Henri had married her. Now, Henriette began sneering at the queen that her children were the true legitimate heirs of France, and Marie was nothing more than a fat banker. As Henri entered into his mid-50s, his libido didn't slow down. One of his final romances was with the sweet, pretty Charlotte de Montmorency, who was just 15 years old when the lecherous king's eye landed on her. Charlotte was a virgin when she and Henry met, and thus liable to be married off, perhaps somewhere far away. So Henri came up with a despicable plan. In order to keep Charlotte close to him, Henri simply married her to one of his courtiers, Henri de Bourbon, so he could have full access to her. Charlotte and Henri actually quite liked each other, and had no desire whatsoever to let the King of France end on their bedroom life. Instead of giving in to a lifetime of his demand, the pair fled Paris and settled in Brussels. Henri was used to getting exactly what he wanted when he wanted it, and he didn't much care for the humanity of any other people involved. He demanded that Charlotte and her husband return to his court immediately, or else he would march into Belgium himself with an army. It was all bravado, but people were getting pretty sick of dealing with King Henry's bedroom appetite, as well as his massive ego. In the spring of 1610, Henri did something he should have done a long time before. He finally agreed to hold an official coronation for his wife Marie de Medici, locking her in as Queen of France nearly a decade after they'd first tied the knot. Of course, he didn't do it out of love. He did it because he was off to fight in a burgeoning war and needed Marie to act as regent. He had no idea at the time that it was one of the last decisions he would ever make. The very day after Marie de Medici's coronation, Henri was in a carriage and stalled in traffic, likely produced by the Queen's coronation, when a man suddenly jumped in from the street and attacked him, stabbing him between the ribs. Throughout his life, Henri had faced dozens of assassination attempts, mostly from people angry about his Protestant faith or his conversion to Catholicism. This time was no different, except that it was successful. The man who had attacked Henri was the Catholic zealot François Ravaillac, and the king died almost instantly. Henri had lived one of the fullest, most debauched lives in royal history, but it was taken from him in one cruel, senseless instant. Nonetheless, his memory lived on. Besides earning nicknames like Henry the Great or the Good King Henry, his reputation only grew after his death, and he soon became an emblem of the spirit of France, even after the French Revolution,